Welcome to the fifth breakdown video of my Mardini submissions. In this one, we go into creating feathers, grooming, scene creation, and rendering in Solaris. The feather tools are quite new and it takes some time to fully understand them. I'm new to the field and I will just explain and show my understanding, so there might be some mistakes. The whole setup can be found for free on Gumroad, link is in the description below. I have changed the textures and materials because I use paid ones from Grayscale Gorilla and other platforms, and I just try to get as close as possible to the original work I created. Let's start with the scattered feathers in the scene. To get started, you have to use the feather shape organize. Here you have two inputs. The first one creates the base shape and the shaft, and in here I use the feather templates. You can download this from the Eagle project or the Bird project from SideFX library, and it's a really cool hip file to also look into and how they use the feather tools. I copied some of the workflows and use this for this here too. The second input just breaks up the shape a little bit, so here you can break up the shape and make it a little bit sharper on top here. Then you can use the feather template from shape to actually create the feather, and I named this so each feather has its own name. I repeat that and copy the setup to match the whole tail feather library here. Then this setup and this one is exactly the same, so we just go over this, and this one is just a copy. I use enumerate to create an ID attribute. So you have a primitive ID attribute. Then to scale them down, I had to use the feather uncondense. If you work with feathers, they are tagged, so you don't have geometry. It's just a primitive with some points. And if you scale them down, it doesn't work well. And if you make them bigger, they get really thin, and it's not what you want. So you have to uncondense them, then transform them. Here I use a UV projection to create some UVs. And to get back to the tagged feathers, you use the match uncondensed, so they are tagged again with the perfect size and shape you want, or you manipulated stuff in here. The feather ray is here to create a CD attribute. Here I use the same template texture I used before. And then I use the loop to bring them all into this. Let's disable this here to the center and to size them. Then I created a sphere. ISO offset to create a volume, scattered some points. Mobs randomized to get a random orientation, but you can also use the attribute randomize sub with the orient attribute and for dimension to have the same result if you don't have mobs, but I recommend to use the free mobs library. It's really cool. Attribute from pieces to get random name attributes on the points, and then a copy to point. I just merged both setups here, just exactly the same with different sizes and a different sphere. Let's have a quick look at the scattering. When I started with Houdini, I had a hard time to understand how to random scatter points and how to change the P scale and everything for simple stuff. So we'll just do a quick breakdown on this too. Let's say you have 3 different objects. You can use a merge pack and enable the name of override attribute. So it creates a name attribute on each piece. You see box, sphere, and torus. Just scale them down slightly. Then you could create a grid, scatter some points, and use a copy to points. Here enable pack and instance so it's faster. Now you have scattered the objects onto the points, but you see each point uses all 3 objects, but you want to randomize the distribution. So you have to use an attribute from pieces. In here you have to input the point cloud and the geometry library. And the output is the points again, so you have the points here. The attribute from pieces actually uses the name attributes from the library and scatter them or copy them to the points. So if we have a look here, the name, enable the visualizer here, each point has a name attribute now. from the input library. You can change the mode to patches, noise, random, or even use custom attributes. I love to just use the cycle mode, it's perfectly fine. But to actually use this, you have to enable piece attribute here on the copy points to see the result. And to randomize the orientation, you can use the attribute randomize, use the orient, orient attribute, and 4 dimension, so you have random orientation. Quick tip, if you use a grid or a height field or something on a flat or a more flat object and not in a volume, you can use the scatter and align sub. You have more options how you want to scatter the points. Just like this here. And disable p-scale. And in here you have some orientation options like the angle of all direction here, or the rotation around the normal. So you have random rotation here. Now let's add some details on the feathers. It's just a quick rundown of the setup because you can't really replicate these things because it will look different based on your feathers and your input geometry and everything. So it's just a quick rundown on how I used some nodes and what things are important. First one is you need a skin, and here I just used 2 spheres to have this as a skin object. Then you have to create some tangent and normals, because if you want to add, for example, some curls, you need stable normals and tangent, and guide tangent space does that for you. You can use all the guide nodes and groom tools for the feathers. They are really well integrated. And yeah, set length to randomize my length of the feathers, hair clump to bend them slightly. Again, to recreate my normals and tangent because they are now bent and I want some better vectors. Then you can create different masks with a guide mask. You can have a noise, a length, a curvature mask, or geometry mask. Then you have a feather clump to create some clumps. Again, create some guide mask, and again a feather clump to break it up even further. You can also use an attribute noise to create a mask. You can bend them. Then you can set the length of each feather. And in here, if you just use curve, it changes the whole size of the curve. And if you change this to feather barbs, you change the size of the feather barbs. Then another mask to bend it slightly. And then a resample with 8 segments on each barb. And a feather width to change the width of each barb and the shaft. And you can also use the remap option here and just play around with it. That's it for the scattered feathers in the scene. Let's start with the bird. Here I use the free animal pack from TrueBones. You will find the link in the description and also on my Gumroad file. I just subdivide my geometry, use a rest attribute. It's important to have rest attributes on all objects if you work with feathers and groomed in general, because you will have a lot of issues if you don't use the rest attribute. Then I created a mask and another one for the leg. And the whole thing is just a blending between the start pose and my pose I want. Just here I just rigged the input skeleton with a rig pose and use a blend to blend them. The blend animation is not really important because later I just use the first frame or the 12th frame for the guides and the rendering. Let's have a look at this one. This is the one I use for rendering, and just use the time shift to freeze the position. Created some different name attributes for the body and just a null to later reference this. Here I used a poly extrude to thicken the wings. Otherwise, if you use or create some guides and you have a thin object or surface, you will only get some guides on top. And if you use a poly extrude, you also get some on the bottom. Then I freeze my post position or my pose I want to use later, and start pose. Create some nulls to later reference this everywhere in the setup. I split the body between two parts. I have some normal hairs on the wings and on the body, and only feathers on the wings. So the body itself don't have any feathers because it was not a real close-up, and hair just worked fine. So let's have a look at the hair for the wings. Here I start with a hair gen to scatter some guides on my model. Change the length with a random length. Guide initialize to set the orientation of the guides. So here you can set the wind direction. Then a hair clump, add some curls. Another hair gen, scatter more hairs around the guides. And in here you can use the rest model we set up here to create the hairs. Then more clumps, and then I use a guide deform. I don't have any simulation, and in a guide deform you will need your guides. This one. You need your guides in hair, your rest skin, and your animated or deformed skin. So you have this setup. Let's have a look here. Then I resampled it and just color it. And here you can use the tightness, and it creates a cool gradient along the hair. Here I created a mask for the body. It's a hair gen. Randomize the length. Guide initialize to orient the guides based on the wind direction. Then I used a guide groom to create some guides on the head, and another one to create smaller ones. I usually use groom beer because I still have a lot of problems with guide groom. It's super slow and it crashes my Houdini file every now and then. And I'm not sure if it's just a Houdini 20 problem and just for this build. But yeah, I just use groom beer for the original one, but I recreated it with the guide groom. So if you don't have groom beer and you want to test out the file, you can do this without paying or using groom beer. After creating the guides, I use a hair gen to create more guides and a hair clump to break up the shape a little. I merge this. Use a hair clump for the whole body, and again a hair generation to create the thicker and more detailed hair. Hair clump, guide process freeze, and here I just merge this with the head guides. Another guide deform, and you see how good the guide deform works with the detailed hair. You get no problems, and it's really cool to use. Resample, colored, and just blast some single hair I don't like. I merge both together, and you have your base viewer for the bird. I use a time shift because here I got some issues with the time, and then I exported it as a USD file because it's quite heavy to use this in Solaris. It's smooth and fast in subs here in the viewport, but if you use this in Solaris, it's quite laggy and slow. So I exported this as a USD file. And if you use the Gumroad file, you can just press save to disk, and it would work fine in Solaris later with the path. Let's start with the feathers. Here I created some guides. Use a guide tangent space to create some normal and tangent vectors. Randomize my length. Use a guide initialize with the wind direction to orient my guides. And now it gets interesting when you work with feathers. I import my templates. I use the uncondense to transform it and make it bigger. Match uncondense, resample the node to have a low res of the feather. And then I use a blast because I just want one feather. I haven't actually found a solution to use random feather templates and to random scatter them on the guides. So I just use one feather, and I will try to find a way for this. So if you have your guides and your feather, you can use a feather template interpolate to copy your feather onto the guide. So it's like uh, a blend. The feather template tries to blend the guides and match the size and the length. And if I change my length here to, let's say, 2, the feather's trying to match the size of the guide. Then I use a guide deform to also bring this up to the deformed or to the post model. And you see it does not work really well. I have some issues here, but I will delete them later. And now it's the same setup as before. I just connected some random nodes to break up the shapes of the feathers to create some clamp and some noise. I banned some of them, feather noise. Here is a resample. The cool thing is if you have a low resolution of the feather, you can just use the resample at the end, and you have the breakup you just did before, like the shape breakup setup and the high resolution one, and it works really well. Then the feather width to change the size, and then I blast some of them. This is the whole setup for the feather and the viewer, and you see I just try to blend them with the viewer on the bird, and it looks really detailed and really nice. But like I said, I have still some problems with feathers and I don't fully understand the whole workflow, but it works just fine for this example. Let's have a look how I created a wall in the background. Here I use the height field noise with a high amplitude, then a height field blur to blur the edges and the sharp spikes here, and just convert it to geometry. Then I use the transform to rotate and place the wall, and I exported it to a USD file for faster preview in Solaris. You see just a simple background. The ground is similar, just a height field and a height field noise. Then the first one I converted to a more high-res geometry for shading and rendering, and I also exported as a USD file. And the second one, and here I use a more low-res geometry and I extrude volume to create a thicker ground to use this as a collision for the pyro simulation. Here I just create a sphere, pyro source, volume rasterize attributes, and pyro solver. I just use the below smoke configure from Houdini, so just a basic smoke simulation here. Which collides with the ground. And you can have a look here. So you see collides with the ground. Then I use the ground here, delete the part I don't need, gather some points, and in the pop network I use the pop network by volume, and I just use the smoke simulation I just created, and pop wind, and a static object for the ground collision. And this looks like this. So you have your smoke interacting with the particles. Let's enable this. And then this is actually unnecessary because you already have the velocity and it's useless. I use a time shift to freeze the frame I want, and attribute adjust flow to create a random p-scale attribute. And in here I use the age attribute created by the pop network to scale the particles based on the age with a channel ramp. And the channel ramp looks like this. You have the name scale based on the age attribute, and I just multiply it with a multiplier channel float to size them along the age. So the older they get, the smaller they are. So you see, you can multiply it, make it bigger and smaller. And I decrease the velocity because it was too strong. Then for the dust, it's a box. ISO offset for volume, scattered some points, and attribute adjust float for random p scale. And here I use a tube, poly extrude to create a ring form and a poly bevel, and just transformed it to the bird model here. It just looks like the bird holds the ring. Here in Solaris, I start to import my crow model with a sub import. I just reference the null I have in the OBJ network. And here I use a sublayer to bring in the USD file, the ground and the wall, and also the hair later. I merge them, and then I use a material library. And for the bird, I just used 3 different subnetworks, the eye, the body, and the wing, and the leg. So I just have 3 different materials, and the ground is mixed noise layer and color ramp, and I convert my height map, also my black and white texture, into a normal map and use this to drive my normals and also the displacement. Then I import my dust, the dust on the ground, the particle, and also the ring here. Just use material library to create all my materials. Here I use the grayscale gorilla material for the ring, but I just created a custom one with a gold texture to, yeah, so you can play around with it. Now let's get to the feathers. If you want to use feathers in Solaris, you have to create a empty, like a primitive here. And I called this feather and procedural, as a pro C for procedural. And you get this thing here, feather procedural. Then I import my feathers, and you see you only get the shaft primitive and not the whole feather with all the bar pairs and everything. To get this, you have to use the Houdini feather procedural. In here, you have to select the feather procedural we just created and the groom rest. The groom rest is the feather model you also imported with this sub import. So you have to select the procedural you just created and the geometry you imported. And to get the preview, you can use the Houdini preview procedural to get your feathers into Solaris with all the details. For the material, I use the Karma hair. Let's delete this. I use the Karma hair and not the actual texture of the feather because just needed some black, slightly reflective texture. But if you want to use a texture, you can just import it with a material image, material X image node, and just select the texture or the template image you used before, and it works just fine to have the textures on the feathers. The feathers on the bird, it's the same setup, but in here I just call it procedural 1, so I don't have the same name twice. And you see all the details on the feathers. And here I imported the viewer with a sublayer because I exported it as a USD file, so get some faster preview here in Solaris. And in here I use the Karma hair again, and I import my display color and use a color ramp, but actually it does nothing, it's just black, so it's not really necessary here. Not sure why I did that, but yeah, just a Karma hair material here. I merged them all together. I created a camera. So here you see it's just a dome light, and I have 4 smaller lights here to fill up the scene. Then a Karma fog box to create a more volumetric atmosphere. And let's have a look at the render. Let's start to have a look at the render. It will take some time because we have a lot of fuel and a lot of feathers. In the Karma render setting, I just have enabled the velocity blur for the instances and for the geometry, and the image output I just enabled the NVIDIA optics denoiser. And you can see all the nice details and the motion blur, feathers. And that's actually the whole scene and the setup in Solaris. Here you can see the lights with the fog box. Thanks for watching, and I hope you can learn something small, and see you in the next one.